brief input around what the article has revealed and why it matters for South Africa. And obviously the first is that the Health Justice Initiative believes that this contract, which has been clouded in a lot of secrecy, and as you'll be aware, the Health Justice Initiative has actually filed an access to information request to get access to all the vaccine contracts. And we are awaiting both the pharmaceutical companies' responses to the request, because government has asked them for their submissions and will then make a decision about whether they'll make it public or not. And before you ask the question about what will happen if they don't, obviously we will take legal action to basically get access to a copy of all the relevant contracts. And I think the article proves why that's even more important now in the middle of a pandemic and also in a constitutional democracy. We believe that some of the findings of the New York Times, and clearly they've seen a copy of that contract, is that we've been put in quite a perilous situation, and that the conduct of Johnson & Johnson has actually been quite scandalous, and we also believe unconstitutional and also immoral. We've said for a long while in the last few months that secrecy has no place in a pandemic, and I think the article goes to the heart of why we've been arguing that. Basically, what we would like to know is that the New York Times has said at least 32 million vaccines have left the shores of South Africa in the last few months. We'd like to know the exact amount, and we believe that Johnson & Johnson should actually come clean and be open about this, especially because it has a separate contract with Aspen on this particular issue. The contract, obviously, with the government of South Africa, according to the New York Times, has done two things. It's forced a waiver in relation to export restrictions and export bans. So it's forced the South African government, in order to receive 32 million or so vaccines from Johnson & Johnson for our vaccine program, which, by the way, most of which has not actually been delivered, and we're getting it on a drip-feed basis, including during the third wave when South Africa faced quite a devastating wave 3. It's basically forced a waiver of sovereignty to leverage unfettered freedom to export vaccines that are filled and finished by Aspen in the Eastern Cape, and they still are exporting. So that we estimate there's at least another 10 million vaccines that are going to leave South Africa's shores, not for Africa, not for South Africa, but for Europe, for countries that have ordered vaccines, and for countries that have quite high vaccination adult coverage already, and for countries that already have enough supplies of vaccines. And unlike countries like the US or even member states of the EU and even India, which basically implemented partial or complete export bans, South Africa has been precluded and prevented from doing that. And it was precluded and prevented from doing that at the time when we were actually facing wave 3. And so I know that there's been some conversations around the current situation of supplies, but this, you must remember, was happening in the last few months and in the last few weeks when South Africa really needed access to sufficient supplies of vaccines, particularly Johnson & Johnson, which is a one-dose vaccine, which was earmarked for a massive rollout in all rural areas because of the cold storage capabilities of this particular vaccine, and because that the delays in Johnson & Johnson in delivering supplies to South Africa at the beginning of the program actually had a massive impact on our vaccine rollout and delayed the program. So we'd like to know what else is in the contract, what other provisions are there that has basically taken away the South African government's rights to deal with this pandemic in terms of the Disaster Management Act, in terms of our constitution. We'd like full disclosure, and we'd like to actually understand better what the New York Times also referred to in its article in relation to the indemnification pools. So we are obviously going to do everything in our power to get access to this particular contract. We believe that in this particular situation, Johnson & Johnson has actually basically done a disservice to South Africa, and they created false hope. And we believe that their conduct in this particular instance needs to be more closely scrutinized and properly investigated. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Next, we'll be hearing from Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng. Dr. T is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. Dr. T, please go ahead. You'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Maza, for that introduction, and thank you, colleagues, for the invitation to join you on this webinar. I think today is one of those days that many of us have been dreading. We would have to be joining again to stress the general call that everyone has the right to life-saving interventions such as the COVID-19 vaccine. And it was already in March 2020 when the former Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health also released a public statement on the issues that are involved in this public health emergency, and really stressed the issue of human rights and why that as an approach, it is key to ensure vaccine equity. And it's important, of course, to note that everyone without exception has the right to life-saving interventions, and this responsibility lies with the government, and that the scarcity of resources or the use of public or private insurance schemes, for example, in South Africa, where there was a previous court case, relating to private insurance schemes, should never be a justification to discriminate against certain groups of patients. And in this case, and in this webinar today, we are discussing the role of business and pharmaceutical companies and how they also are playing a very important role, and unfortunately a negative role, in ensuring that we end vaccine inequity. It's important again to remind everyone that we all have a right to health, and we also have a right to advances in biomedical sciences that are very important to the realization of the right to health. And equally important are all other human rights and the principles of non-discrimination, participation, which is very important, which has been a missing element in many of the discussions in the different regions of the world, and also the issues of empowerment and also accountability. And we know that to have accountability, there needs to be transparency, which is another element that has been missing. Many of advocates and civil society, academics, scientists, as well as independent UN experts have been talking broadly about the need for transparent leadership, as well as accountability to get us to a point where we have justice in health-related policies. It's also important to note that, of course, there have been emerging issues, different time frames and timelines in the different waves of the pandemic in the different regions of the world, and the special procedures we've issued in the region of excess of 287 letters relating to concerns directly connected to the COVID-19 pandemic, or some of the measures adopted in the context of the pandemic. And it's very important to reaffirm the right of every human being without distinction of any kind to the enjoyment of the highest standard of physical health. And again, in November 2020, the Special Rapporteurs released a statement that reminding, of course, the state of their role in the responses to the pandemic. And we often talk about leaving no one behind, but we know that billions of people in the global south are already left behind. This is not a crisis that is yet to happen or the impact of which is yet to be felt. People are already dying because of vaccine inequity, both as a result of governments that have not been able to plan, but also, very importantly, the role of pharmaceutical companies in the response to a global pandemic. And the question is, who is setting the agenda and for whose benefit, and why are profits made to go before human life? And the situation currently of vaccine apartheid, vaccine inequity, is really unnecessarily prolonging the crisis, the human suffering, the economic distress, and sowing further seeds of social unrest and inequity. And in closing, Maza, I just want to say that in the statement of November 2020, we actually wrote and reminded the states of their obligations to comply with the international obligations ensuring access to medicines. We also talked about ensuring the important technologies, intellectual property data, and the know-how of COVID-19 vaccines to be shared widely, and including developing countries with scaling up development, manufacturing, and distribution. It's not enough to give the developing countries end product that are just filling vials to be distributed again outside of the regions in the global south that desperately need this life-saving medicine. And just one last thing is that it's important again to remind pharmaceutical companies that as they discharge their responsibilities, they do have a responsibility to exercise human rights due diligence. And we have these guiding principles on business and human rights that the UN has produced particularly for a time such as this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. T. Just a note for those of you who have joined in the last couple of minutes, please switch your camera off unless you're the speaker. Of course, mute your audio as well. The chat box has been disabled while the presenters are giving their introductions, but you will have an opportunity to use the chat box to ask questions once we're done with this section. There will be a Q&A. So now we are going on to Moses Mulumba. Moses is the director for the Center for Health, Human Rights and Development in Uganda. Moses, please go ahead. You'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers for putting together such an important presser. I think today more than ever, history is continuing to repeat itself when we see that the African ground is being used as a ground for improving the lives of everyone else except the Africans. And I think that this is actions that are not acceptable. I think we have witnessed this right from the colonial times when resources in the African continent were taken away. And I think the taking away of the resources on the African continent can be interpreted variously, including on this particular actions that we see. I think finding the African ground as the ground for production of vaccines that are much needed in Africa, but they are not going to be supporting the African continent is just terrible. I think while we are concerned that the production is in South Africa, the South African production would certainly mean a lot for countries like Uganda, where I am based. We have witnessed that throughout the COVID-19 season, countries like Uganda and the rest in Africa have continued to grapple with dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. Access to vaccines remains a big thing. While everyone has been looking at lockdowns, countries have used lockdowns to prepare themselves, including ensuring maximum vaccinations as much as possible. Unfortunately, our lockdowns have not helped. They have only shattered the lives of people that we see. People have lost economic power. People have lost, access to treatment for other health conditions. But at the same time, we have not used the time to prepare ourselves because we cannot have access to things like vaccines. We have watched the Europeans, we've watched people in America with lives coming back. People are in the field watching football without masks. This cannot happen on the continent. It cannot happen simply because we are not receiving the vaccination that is needed. In a country like Uganda, where we have a population of 44 million people, we have not even reached the target that we had set of 4 million vaccinations. We have only been able to immunize 1.7 people in the population. And this is not just the people that need the vaccines, but including those that are on the front line. I think we have witnessed a situation where the government has even committed much more money than ever before from other sectors to ensure that we receive the vaccines, but we cannot find the vaccines on the market. And our permanent secretary, the Minister of Health, have categorically said that on the global market, they cannot be able to access vaccines because vaccines have been taken over by brokers, the international market brokers. Now, it's very difficult to understand what this kind of action actually means and what it means for the African continent, which cannot access vaccines even when they need to access these vaccines. We spent years, and everyone has actually told the African continent that let's utilize the TRIPS flexibilities. Let's make sure that these flexibilities are enabling as much as possible. Unfortunately, we are witnessing that even if we have good policies, we have the TRIPS flexibilities, we cannot be able to use our own ground to manufacture as much as we can. And these flexibilities become totally difficult to be utilized when we cannot have pharmaceutical industries used for the production of the Africans rather than production that goes outside the continent. And this is not something that we should take for granted. I think the coloniality and the colonial approaches of using the African ground to actually profit or enable other continents to be able to get out of a crisis like COVID-19 is not acceptable. I think it leaves three questions. The first is, what does global solidarity mean? I think global solidarity would totally lose meaning when we see that the solidarity is being abused on coming to the African continent to manufacture vaccines and they get out of the continent, other than supporting those that mostly need the vaccines at a time like this. The question of South to South, I think the talk about cooperation by southern countries, Uganda and South Africa, for instance, this whole talk has been shattered by the fact that we can have a manufacturing that happens in South Africa, and then all the way vaccines go and they cannot reach Uganda, but they go elsewhere. The South to South cooperation that has always been promoted by everyone, including global actors, is something that we've lost. I also see that the whole efforts of the African Union, where we are making efforts to ensure that we do not lose vaccines, is an effort that we are shattering. It's an effort that we are losing, because if we cannot access vaccines from out, but cannot also access those that we are producing, inside here, it becomes a problem. It takes forward the challenges of equity that we have always witnessed when medical professionals and health professionals keep being trained on this ground and they are taken out. I think these kind of inequities, these kind of unacceptable practices need to be spoken about. We need to criticize them and ensure that we have much more equitable access to vaccines that we do need along. Lastly, I think we should call upon the global community to totally criticize this kind of approach. We cannot have a pharmaceutical company on the ground being used to actually manufacture vaccines and they get out of the continent. I think these are things that the World Health Organization at the global level and the regional level needs to pick up, and we totally challenge it. As civil society groups, we'll try as much as possible to go against these, release the statements as much as we can, but also take class actions against practices like this. I want to thank you very much and looking forward to further conversations on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Moses. So we'll be wrapping up our intros now with Dr. Matthew Kavanagh. Matthew Kavanagh is the Director of Global Health Policy and Politics, the Director of Global Health Policy and Politics Initiative at Georgetown University in the US. Welcome, Dr. Kavanagh. You'll have 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. What is really clear is that global health efforts to achieve vaccine equity have failed. They've been based on the idea that we could count on a few companies, that if there was money, if there was demand, that the best we could do was to count on a few high-income country-based companies to produce vaccines for the world. Today, we definitively learned that this was a failed approach. There's a lot of talk about equitable allocation, but we need to realize that currently, it's not up to public health officials. It's not up to the World Health Organization or even the South African government or the African Union to distribute. Indeed, it's companies who are deciding which countries get what portion of vaccines on what timeline. South Africa started negotiating in September 2020 with Johnson & Johnson. COVAX tried to get doses from Johnson & Johnson. South Africa even got a contract from Johnson & Johnson for 11 million doses, to which they added 20 million more. The African Union got a contract in March for 220 million doses, plus an option for 180 million more. But basically no supplies came. As of June, just 1.8 million doses had arrived in South Africa, according to the South African government. If the vaccines had happened when the demand happened early on, then we could have saved many, many lives. I was just looking here to see that since February 26th, when South Africa finally signed its agreement with Johnson & Johnson to buy doses, 27,357 South Africans have died. Since March 29th, when the African Union signed its agreement with Johnson & Johnson to buy 220 million doses, 71,355 people have died in the African countries. How many of these could be saved is a question. But if we look at high-income countries where vaccines have been delivered, even as cases have spiked, deaths have stayed low. This tells us how powerful the vaccines are. But instead, Johnson & Johnson shipped at least 32 million doses to Europe and to North America. Now look, there is an alternative proposal out there to this dependence on a few corporations and allowing them to have all the power in deciding where vaccines go. The core piece of that has been the idea of local production. We need to share knowledge, have technology transfer, and ensure that there are multiple companies and governments around the world producing vaccines. Johnson & Johnson received $1 billion from Operation Warp Speed here in the United States. Hundreds of millions more were invested to set up new production lines. Moderna, meanwhile, received over $2 billion. Pfizer received a fair amount of money, both from the United States and from the European Union, as did all of the other producers. But instead of taking that as a public investment and ensuring that then all the producers in the world who were qualified could be making those doses, instead, we've ended up with these monopoly-based pieces. Aspen does not have a real license to produce. It's acting as a contractor for Johnson & Johnson. They're just filling and finishing, meaning Johnson & Johnson sends them vaccine substance. It is Johnson & Johnson that decides where the doses go. It's Johnson & Johnson that sets the price. Aspen is just filling and finishing. The same approach was just announced by Pfizer and BioVac to much fanfare. This is a failed approach. Instead, what we need is an approach that actually says, look, we need multiple licenses to multiple companies around the world. This is what happens in HIV. For example, when the newest HIV drugs have come onto the market, they've come with technology transfer and licensing, meaning that the originator company gives the know-how, the knowledge, and the permission to companies in multiple different places to make as much of that drug as they want, right? And sell it at the price that they can to the producers that they want. What we have seen is that the place where production happens is dictating who gets access. Currently, two things are possible. One, every company could be licensing and transferring technology to producers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to make these vaccines tomorrow. And two, high-income countries like the Biden administration can be using their legal authority to compel this sharing. If we were doing that, then you could be in a position where African leaders could be actually making allocation decisions based on public health. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Kavanaugh. So now we will be going to a question and answer. For those of you who have just joined us, there is a box, which I think a chat box that has now been enabled for you to put your questions in the chat if you would like. You can also raise your hand and ask a question. I would ask two things. One, say your name and which outlet you're from. And if there's a particular person that you would like to direct your question to, please make that clear. I just want to let people know that unfortunately, Dr. T will have to leave shortly. So anybody who has a question for Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, please let's start with those questions because she has patients to see and she needs to sign off in a few minutes. So Dr. T, I hope you're still here. If anybody has questions for her, please go ahead. I do have one question in the chat here. We have Arisa from Media 24 in South Africa. And this is really, I think, more of a question probably for Dr. Kavanaugh or Fatima, if you're aware, when exactly did 32 million doses leave South Africa and how many lives could have been spared if these vaccines had stayed in Africa, which that second one is a tough one. Fatima, do you have a sense of when exactly the 32 million doses left South Africa?
Thanks. Yeah. So according to the New York Times article, the records that they have reviewed, and we've put the link to the article in the chat box, is that the export started happening from March already. It could have been earlier, but there's been no sharing of information, and there's been so much protection over J&J and not enough questioning and interrogation, and they just basically, in our opinion, are refusing to be accountable and to share information. So we believe, according to the information provided in the New York Times article, it started as far back as March, which you'll remember was the same time at which we were supposed to be starting full speed with our vaccination program. So March, April, May, June, we believe that millions of vaccines actually left our country when we and other people in Africa needed it the most. And Matthew, I think just before me, explained sort of some of the estimates of the number of people's lives that could have been saved. So, we would describe this as a most vile situation. And I really believe that people in South Africa and Africa have been wronged. You'll remember, to the journalist who asked the question, that we were desperately waiting for that 2 million doses. That was part of the contamination issue in Baltimore. And as a result, we got, 300,000 of soon-to-expire doses for teachers eventually. And we got, a few batches of donations. So it was hardly sustainable and hardly sufficient. Meanwhile, without disclosing or being transparent about this, millions of doses were actually leaving the country that could have been used to save people's lives in South Africa and Africa.
Thank you, Fatima. Dr. T, just before you leave us, there is a question that is partially directed to you from Mohomotsi at the Associated Press. Can we have a comment from you, Dr. T, on the fact that officials in the US are recommending that vaccinated citizens should receive a booster shot 8 months after being fully vaccinated, this despite the shortage of vaccines in South Africa and Africa in general? So your comment on that as a medical provider.
Thanks, Maza. I think it speaks directly to the issues and the challenges faced in clinical settings on the ground that would need good policy and good public health politics to influence and to assist in responding. And I think the main thing is that it will be still inequitable and advancing and deepening existing inequities if you have people who are already having the vaccines which have been proven to be efficacious, they work, they prevent severe illness, they prevent deaths, to then be the same recipients of a booster dose when you have large populations of people in the world who have yet to receive a single dose. And I think it's at the back of that I would suggest that countries should wait and rather look at ensuring that their own governments support various UN resolutions, but also support very intentionally and very clearly proactive leadership, both in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as in the national and as well as the regional centers in this world, to ensure that we can get to a point where everyone is vaccinated. And look, the issue of vaccine boosters is not foreign to the COVID-19. Many of us in the healthcare professionals, we take boosters for tetanus, we take boosters for hepatitis. So it's not something that is, purely a COVID-19 issue, but because it's happening when so many people around the world have already been left out of the vaccine rollout, it would really deepen existing inequities. And in fact, as we always say, if you protect one region of the world, you are just shooting yourself in the foot, because those gains will be very short-lived. You won't have the success that you wish for. It's only when everyone everywhere who needs this vaccine has access and the shot in the arm that we can then start to talk about boosters for individuals who are already protected.
Thank you very much, Dr. T. We appreciate you coming despite your busy schedule. I know that you will need to sign off shortly. Just a reminder for everyone that I know some of the journalists also need to sign off because of another competing press conference. This press conference is being recorded, and I believe that Health Justice Initiative will make it available to everyone. For the speakers, the questions are being addressed to you specifically, but if one of the other speakers would like to jump in, please just let me know. So here, Fatima, I have a question for you from Aaron Bates from Business Day. Was the application for the contract a PAIA application? If so, in which court was it launched? And are HJI's court papers freely available?
Thanks. So just before I answer that, just want to add to what Dr. T has said, and that is that the WHO has called for a moratorium on booster shots until at least 10% of people in the global south can be vaccinated. And we would support that call, and we would say that the percentage should even be higher. So we are in a really perilous situation in the world where the figures that the WHO are releasing for the vaccination coverage for Africa is less than 3%. So less than 3% of people in Africa have been fully vaccinated at a time when we're dealing with multiple variants and waves, a devastating increase in the number of cases and also death. And meanwhile, the rich north, which has sufficient supplies, overordered, basically cleared the shelves in September 2020 already, got ahead of the curve, undermined COVAX, are now basically ordering booster shots. And that's definitely what the US government has just done. We'll also talk about that. And that is why the issue, Aaron, about the contracts are so important, because we need to understand, while a lot of fanfare has been made about these licenses with BioVac or with Aspen, where exactly are those supplies going? When will it actually enter the system in Africa? So we haven't launched a court application as yet. We've just filed the access to information request. That expires on the 25th of August. This government has asked us for a bit of extra time because they are engaging, according to the Director General, with vaccine manufacturers, where they are asking them to make written or oral submissions about whether the contract should be disclosed in full or in part. If we don't get a positive response from the vaccine manufacturers, the companies who we believe are acting like God in the middle of a pandemic, where they have total unfettered control, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer in particular, then we will go to court, Aaron. And all of our statements around the access to information filings are definitely on our website. Once we go to court, we will make those papers public. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to, and Dr. T, please let me know if you can stay a little bit longer. We do have a new question for you. Thank you. But before we do that, I'm sorry, Dr. Kavanagh, I didn't ask you to chip in on the number of lives saved. There was a question there. Do you have a sense of the number of lives that could have been saved if the vaccines had been rolled out earlier?
So what we know is that in high-income countries where vaccines have been rolled out, countries around the world have seen a third wave. But what's happened where there's high vaccination coverage is that there's been a third wave without massive deaths. That has not happened in African countries. And so the numbers that I was citing earlier, which is that since February 26th, when South Africa signed its agreement with Johnson & Johnson to buy those doses, if immediately doses had been supplied, that could have started driving down deaths, right? Because remember that we target vaccines to the most vulnerable, to the older people who are most likely to die. 27,000 people, 357 have died since that date. In the African Union writ large, who has ordered 220 million and until a few weeks ago had received none of their order. In that period, 71,000 people have died of COVID. And so these are largely avoidable deaths. And we're not saying 100% of them are avoidable. We don't have a model that shows that exactly. But these are tens of thousands of people whose lives likely could have been saved with vaccinations, as they have been in countries like Germany. Instead, Johnson & Johnson was sending vaccines to Germany to vaccinate young, healthy people who were at low risk of death. And that's the deep inequality. Right now, we're talking about a new push to get even more vaccines to boost people who are young and healthy often. And so that is deeply reprehensible and is, in fact, costing lives. This is not a good public health decision. Instead, it's a good corporate decision.
Thank you for that. Dr. Mofokeng, and also I would like Moses to chip in on this. There's a question from Kyle Cohen from News 24 about the responsibility of governments. He points out that the government delayed its engagement with vaccine makers, and this might have had a detrimental impact not only on the
less space in the fiscal area for budgets to be moved swiftly to respond to the pandemic. And we remember also in South Africa, the poor response in terms of social protections, food assistance, and people literally getting to health facilities was a problem. But many of these also reflect previous challenges and previous issues that existed in the public health system that COVID-19 has compounded. And I think, of course, and South Africa doesn't speak enough about this, right? Together with India, they're the ones that led the TRIPS waiver proposal at the WTO. And because of the secrecy and the lack of transparency, they didn't quite garner enough support and gain that momentum to try and push these issues and have allies across the board. And that's the one dominating theme in this pandemic. It's the level of secrecy that doesn't allow us to then actually have this conversation with the necessary depth and the necessary accuracy in terms of numbers. And I think that is part of a global deliberate act, I think, on my part, to evade accountability, because you can't fight when you don't know the details and what it is, that has been contained. And in part, in South Africa, we may say, look, at the WTO, they did brilliant by proposing that resolution. But when you come on a national stage and you reflect on social and social support, you may think differently. So I don't think there's one answer that says government did well or badly. I mean, earlier this year, together with HJI, I submitted an expert affidavit precisely to support the government in its role in leading and affirming its state obligations per human rights. And so we have to do everything well at the same time. Unfortunately, with this pandemic, you can't do some things really well and some things really badly, because at the end of the day, it's about the entire response, and it needs everyone in the chain to be working properly, ethically, with accountability in mind.
Thank you very much, Dr. T. Moses, if you could add in your perspective from Uganda, please, about the government's responsibilities.
I think in a public health crisis like COVID-19, it re-emphasizes the role of government. And, you know, for me, it's at two levels. You either provide what the people want, and if you cannot provide, you let others provide it, but you regulate. So we cannot negate the function of the state in regulating and keep running back to market forces. I think there are moments when market forces are completely nonsensical, and any sensible government cannot just look on practices like what we see in Johnson & Johnson, and we continuously argue that actually the government cannot be blamed. These productions are happening in a territory. These territories where they are happening, they are manned by laws, they are manned by regulations. At what point in time do we wake up and say that the laws have been brought to actually be able to, control practices like this? Some of them are common sense things that have to be done. But I also think that bilateral arrangements have to be done. These are moments when the government cannot run away from the marketplace. I think it's the moment when the government must come into the marketplace and clearly have bilateral arrangements, purely on market kind of arrangements which we are witnessing. So I think that it's not tenable for us to continuously look at just the private sector and leave the government go scot-free when it has actually enacted. It is an inaction, which I think is a big problem. And within the human rights framework, part of what the government is supposed to be doing is to protect. So part of the protection actually extends its own obligations towards ensuring that it does protect its people to access the medicines. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Moses. Fatima, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just a few things. I think that the fault of vaccine makers in this particular case, pharmaceutical companies, are not understood enough, which is why it took so long for publication like the New York Times to actually tell us what's going on in the contract with the South African government. And I think that what that does is it creates so much of emphasis on the role of governments, on the role of COVAX, and there isn't sufficient scrutiny on the real complicity and moral kind of or immoral behavior of these pharmaceutical companies who basically have our entire destiny in their hands. And and the reason why I say that, and we will continue saying this, is that because by September 2020, Human Rights Watch already stated in a report that rich nations had bought up the world's supplies of vaccines. You didn't stand a chance waiting for COVAX or even a bilateral. Strive, Masiwa from the AU Vaccine Acquisition Task Team said by December 2020 already, even before vaccines were authorized for use in different jurisdictions, when they approached pharmaceutical companies like J&J in particular and Pfizer, they were told that with all the money that you have, irrespective, there are no supplies for you. You will not be prioritized as the global south because richer nations have already bought up all the supplies. This is well documented by the WHO and many other reputable organizations and human rights bodies that the supplies were bought up by September already. We are the first to take on our government. We are the first to criticize. We will be the first to litigate against it. But in this particular case, Johnson & Johnson has let us down. In this particular case, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson is acting like God. They have a non-disclosure agreement. They have indemnification provisions, which one of Matthew's colleagues has actually reviewed the contract at the request of the New York Times and has found provisions that are so egregious, that are so invasive, that are so broad, that they're even broader than many of the contracts that they've seen that Johnson & Johnson has signed in Europe and in the US. So, the problem is that Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and Moderna and many of these other companies, and I'll just limit this to Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, did not prioritize Africa. They've prioritized certain VIP customers, and we know who those customers are. Those are all the nations that are blocking the waiver. And this is borne out by the facts before us. And the reason why I say that is because even with the production capacity of Aspen and the millions of doses that are already left and the contract that we have with Aspen, what is the number going from Johnson & Johnson via Aspen to Africa by the end of 2021? Of the 220 million contract, it is 50 million. 50 million vaccines will reach Africa from Johnson & Johnson by the end of the year. So this tells us that there is a disproportionate amount of power that Johnson & Johnson is exercising. It's prioritizing countries that don't need the vaccines, and it is leaving behind the countries that do need the vaccines, because 1.3 billion people is not going to achieve any kind of population immunity with 50 million doses by the end of the year. Now we're being told that in January and February, somehow by some miracles, it hasn't happened before, that Aspen is going to churn out 25 million vaccines every month, and that's how Africa will be sorted out. Even if that's possible, what you were saying is that Africa must wait to 2022 before it gets a sufficient supply of vaccines. Why? Why does Africa matter less, or the global south? Why is there a prioritization of certain nations? The reason for their prioritization is because these customers had advanced purchase orders. They're treating this as a market transaction, and basically the market, in my view, and in the view of many of us here, it's actually let us down, which is the reason why J&J can exercise this unfettered exercise of power and control. So in this particular case, we do believe that the South African government was in a hostage situation. They've said as much. They were told, sign the vaccine contract with these provisions and these waivers and these exemptions, or else you won't get your 32 million. So basically, that was the carrot and stick approach that was used by Johnson & Johnson. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatima. I would just like to encourage everyone, you can still put questions in the chat, or if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we can enable your video and your microphone if it's not enabled at the moment. In the meantime, Dr. Kavanagh, do you have anything to add about the government's responsibilities that you would like to share with us?
Thanks. I think we should be very, very clear that the contract that, as Fatima was saying, the South African government was under the gun to sign in order to get any access to vaccines was breathtaking. It actually requires the South African government to make new law and change policy as a matter of contract law in a secret contract between the government and the corporation. This is deeply bad practice, but the government really had no option, because their options were to go to Pfizer, who was refusing to sell large amounts, Moderna, who was refusing to sell any. We had known that the AstraZeneca vaccine was not particularly effective in South Africa. And so the government was really up a creek without very many paddles to get back with. And the result is that we see this breathtaking contract. One of the key provisions of that contract is that the South African government must commit not to impose export controls to keep doses from leaving the country to go to Europe and North America. These are the exact same laws that Europe used. When Europe wanted to make sure that doses stayed in Europe, they used export laws because their contracts included no such provisions. But the South African contract, as a condition of getting access to any vaccines, included a prevention of the government from using its sovereign authority. It also required the government to institute a no-fault compensation policy that is deeply favorable to the interests of the company, far more so than, for example, the US no-fault compensation policy. This one is far more beneficial to Johnson & Johnson. These are all provisions in a contract. We shouldn't be making law via secret contracts, and instead we've allowed that to happen. Unfortunately, this is a crisis of global governance. The choice could have been that governments like mine in the United States could have partnered with the South African government to assure that there could be multiple production capacities across the world so that no company had a monopoly. But it is basic economics that when one company or a few companies have a monopoly over life-saving interventions, that they will extract high prices and have all the power. We have allowed that to happen. It is a failure of global governance, and it is a failure of high-income countries, far more than of the South African government.
Thank you, Dr. Kavanagh. And I think you've actually responded to Erin Bates's question here from Business Day. She actually would like to know if you could share the report or excerpts of the report. You've already shared quite a bit now. What is the ability to share a little bit more information with the journalists?
We know from the New York Times reporting some of the provisions that are in there. And so that, I think, is the report that I have at hand to share. I think hopefully Fatima will be successful in getting access to this full contract. Because look, one of the things that, again, we need to go back to kind of what this looks like in global governance. This contract should not be secret. It's a procurement contract. That is bad procurement policy, but it's the thing that Johnson & Johnson and all of the other companies were allowed to require, and governments went along with it. And back to Moses's point, this is a role of governments, but it's a role of international governments together, right? This is a collective action problem that has to be solved collectively. If governments together, high-income country and low-income country and middle-income country together, were to say, we are going to talk about what a framework for sharing vaccine knowledge and know-how and production looks like together, then governments would have more power than corporations. But right now, the corporations have all the power. And so what we know is that this contract imposes remarkable, breathtaking provisions that I'm happy to talk about on the side if folks are looking for more information. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions coming in now. I would like to encourage any of the journalists, if you don't want to type in a question, if you'd like to ask one out loud. If not, I will give anybody on the panel who would like to have a few wrap-up words the opportunity to do that. We have 10 minutes remaining. I'll give the journalists an opportunity to ask more questions. If not, would anybody on the panel like to give a final statement as we wrap up this press conference on the New York Times article?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously I'm going to try and emphasize the situation in South Africa, because there is this narrative that we have enough supplies, but we don't have enough supplies. We've done the analysis. We may not have increased vaccine uptake, but I think that's a different issue. Johnson & Johnson hasn't even delivered more than 6 million of the 32 million contracts. So I think what we need your support on is to ask Johnson & Johnson and government and Aspen for the full details of all the contracts. Why are we having to do a PAIA request in the middle of a pandemic? This does not make sense. The next pandemic, this cannot be the way in which we manage this, the situation of sharing of information and access to information, because we're paying for the vaccines. We need access to those vaccines. And what secrecy does is it creates a lot of distrust, social incohesion, as Dr. Tlaleng has mentioned earlier, but it also means that it can contribute to vaccine hesitancy because there just isn't enough sharing of information. We need to also know when Johnson & Johnson is going to revise the terms of this contract so that we can immediately start sending millions and millions of doses to other countries in Africa. 50 million by the end of 2021 is actually a moral crime. It is wrong. There are people dying and getting sick in high numbers in other parts of Africa. There's countries in Africa that hasn't even administered one single shot of a vaccine. The J&J vaccine is safe, it's effective, it's one dose, it's easier to get into which may not have the necessary infrastructure at the moment. And so it's really, it's a life-saving, I think, matter here about trying to get as many vaccines as possible and not to send the 10 million to Europe in the next few months, because we've been told wait until October. That's only when the pipeline will be for Africa. And then, of course, we need to ask Johnson & Johnson, why only Aspen? There are at least 4 or 5 other companies in Africa that could be doing this. If we have a fire at the Aspen plant, if there's a riot at the Aspen plant, if there's issues with the drug substance from a particular plant in the US, it means the entire supply chain for South Africa and Africa is affected, and that's not going to be particularly useful. And then I think as South African journalists, we need to ask for more details of that very rapidly established indemnification scheme that Matthew had talked about. This was done under the watch of the previous minister. Remember, this contract was signed under the previous minister as well. So, you can ask questions till you're blue in the face about why did you sign a contract, but clearly we were in a hostage situation. You had to sign it or else you wouldn't get the vaccines. But we can ask questions about that particular scheme, which was basically established within 5 days. I've done this work for 25 years. I've never seen government act on law so fast. We're waiting years for the Patent Amendment Bill to be signed, but we quickly set up an indemnification scheme to make J&J and Pfizer happy. 2 CEOs who are only accountable to their board members and to their shareholders. They're not accountable to us as the South African public. And we set up an indemnification scheme to basically serve their interests. So yeah, those are just some of the final comments that I'd like to make around transparency, accountability, and secrecy. My colleagues and I have written a piece in the British Medical Journal yesterday. We're calling this a moral crime that is tantamount to a crime against humanity, because if you hoard vaccines And if you decide not to share vaccines fast enough based on profit motives, based on financial incentives, based on market forces, then you have to be held accountable for what is currently happening in the world. And there is a lot of sickness and a lot of death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. We have a few minutes remaining. Would any of the other panelists like to make a closing statement? Dr. Kavanaugh, there is an additional question here for you. Do the NFC regulations in the US absolve companies from financial consequences for successful claims? Are the US claims not covered by federal funding? And do you have any thoughts on the expectation that there will be a low number of successful claims, or is your concern more about the nature of the clause? That's another question from Kyle from News 24. And once you answer that, if you have any closing comments, if you could make those as well. And then Dr. Mofokeng and Moses, I'll give you an opportunity as well before we wrap up.
Thanks, Maza. A few thoughts. So on no-fault compensation systems in the United States, in Japan, in France, I believe, in most high-income countries, industry has to actually contribute toward a portion of the funding for the compensations that happen. That way, industry actually has an incentive not to have bad vaccines out there. What we don't want to incentivize folks to shy away from making vaccines because they're worried that they might be sued. And so there's a reasonable conversation around what a no-fault compensation system looks like. But this no-fault compensation system means the government bears the entire burden of risk. It does not incentivize Johnson & Johnson or others to make sure that their vaccines are safe. And it excludes the Johnson & Johnson from legal liability from lawsuits, even from government themselves, even from state governments, et cetera. This is a breathtaking and remarkable provision that gives Johnson & Johnson incredible protection. Overall, let me just close with three specific requests. One is the World Trade Organization waiver would allow legal security so that any government, any company that wanted to, or any government that wanted to set up production of COVID-19 vaccines could do so without being sued under WTO law. That's a first step. Second, companies need to give licenses. They need to share the technology so that Aspen can make all of the vaccine that it wants to from start to finish and produce it for whatever country wants to buy it, and with a focus on the African continent. The same can happen by BioVac. The same can happen in Senegal. The same can happen in Vietnam. The same can happen in Brazil. The same can happen in Thailand today, tomorrow. And third, governments need to actually use their legal authority to compel the sharing of know-how. The Biden administration has been sitting on the fact that it has legal authority under the Defense Production Act. It owns the patent on the Moderna vaccine. It has been sitting on its power to actually compel companies to share the know-how so that Aspen, so that BioVac, so that companies and governments around the world can make vaccines for their own populations. The result is that Johnson & Johnson gets to decide who gets vaccines when and where. We see now that is a failed approach to global health, and it needs to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kavanaugh. So Dr. Mofokeng and Moses, you will have the opportunity to wrap us up. The view from the health provider in South Africa and the human rights activist in Uganda. Dr. Mofokeng, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I just want to say that the analysis of the global COVID-19 pandemic should be based on the extent to which the application of the right to health principles were applied. And I think this is very important because we are dealing with human rights issues here. It's not just an issue of market forces or pharmaceuticals. It is clearly a human rights issue. And I think it is important to acknowledge the existing structural fault lines and the power dynamics in the global health space that mimic coloniality and colonialism, even though we've gotten past formal colonialism. But if you examine what is happening, the shifts in power that are necessary will mean that we need to actually be honest about some of the reasons why other people are seen as not worthy of life or of economic, social, or cultural participation. And I will close it here, Maza, because we are out of time. But that's just what I want to say, that business is not exempt from human rights. There are guiding principles that have been developed for that purpose, and we shouldn't be putting profits before human lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And final word, very briefly, Moses, from you, please.
I think that it's very clear from the presser that, gagging a South African pharmaceutical company is not just a South African business. It's an African business, and everyone has to be concerned about that. But this is not also a moment to have disempowered governments. I think for me, we cannot be talking about governments disempowering themselves through their own laws. I think that's just unacceptable, and it's important that global solidarity is looked at. And then very lastly for me, colonialism manifests differently. The governments no longer show their faces in colonialism. Governments are hiding under private companies. It is the governments that have funded these companies to develop vaccines. Those very governments are the ones that are dictating the rules that are applying to the African continent. So I think that as we think about interventions, decolonization is very important. We need to decolonize access to vaccines as much as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Health Justice Initiative for organizing this press conference. As we said, it has been recorded, and I believe, Fatima, you can confirm that it will be shared. Fatima Hassan from the Health Justice Initiative, Dr. Mofokeng, UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Health, Moses Mulumba from the Center for Health and Human Rights and Development in Uganda, and our comrade from the Global North, Dr. Matthew Kavanagh from Georgetown University. Thank you all for making the time, and thank you to the journalists for also making the time for this really important press conference. We really appreciate it. I'm Maza from the African Alliance, and thank you very much.
Thank you all.